From a religious standpoint, what are your views on like the Chico scrap metal yard and its impact on like the community?
Well, I guess, from my perspective, I mean, I don't come from a religious tradition, but I certainly feel like humans should respect the natural world. So I would say that, if anything, it's a moral position, not from a specific religious tradition.
From several different religious perspectives, it raises questions of justice and fairness as to where various impactful sites are located to the local community. So I think all religions would have something to say about the issue of justice and fairness of that. I think they would all have several of them. Christianity, some versions of Christianity, let's say, would be especially concerned for the impact on people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or people from racial or ethnic minorities. And if it's shown that the negative impacts of a place like Chico Scrap Metal are having a disproportionate impact on those minority communities or on those lower socioeconomic groups, then that would be special concern, because those people ought to be more mindful of defending those people. I guess the way I think about it is not so much religious, but there's a perspective called social ecology. And in fact, we talked about this in my class yesterday, my religion, ethics, and ecology class, just very briefly. But social ecology says there's a connection between ecological issues such as pollution and issues of class and race and ethnicity. And social ecology says it's no accident that we typically find junkyards or incinerators or waste dumps in neighborhoods that are predominantly minority groups or predominantly people from lower socioeconomic classes, so that it's not possible to deal with ecological issues independent of issues of race and class, and it's not possible to deal with race and class independent of ecological issues. So these are just different vantage points.
Do you know of any like local churches that are working with any like environmental groups in the area to try to get it to relocate?
The local Quaker community, they may well have taken a stand on this. They may be involved in this. And a person that I know from that community is Jim Anderson, and I'm sure he would be more than happy to email with you or talk with you on the phone or have a personal interview if you have time for that. He's been involved both with the Quaker meeting and also with the Chico Peace and Justice Center. And there's a lot of overlap between several of the religious communities and the Chico Peace and Justice Center. And I think maybe the Chico Peace and Justice Center has been involved in this ongoing discussion of the scrap metal place. And I think people who would be happy to talk with you about this would be somebody like Ted Sandberg, who's the pastor at First Baptist Church on Palmetto Avenue. And another person I think would be very happy to talk with you about this is a pastor named Jim Peck, who is the pastor of New Vision Congregational Church on Mangrove. Jim he's had a kind of a background in politics before he became a minister. He's been very active in attending city council meetings, and he's really up on local city council issues. I think he'd be a really good source for you guys to talk to.
Last question. What different attitudes towards nature might underlie this conflict in regards to religion?
Boy, that's such a big, broad question. And that's the kind of, we talk about religious attitudes toward nature in my religion, ethics, and ecology class, but to bring it down to earth on this specific issue, I guess right now, off the top of my head, it seems to me that I've kind of been following this in the news. I'm not certainly no expert on it. I haven't been following all the details, but it seems to me that it tends to be boiling down to property rights, and how do we strike a balance between the property rights of these business owners and what's in the best interest of the larger community as a whole. And I think our political system in general tends to uphold property rights, the property rights of individuals, and gives more emphasis to that than it does to this idea of the common good. And I think, on the contrast, most religious traditions say, yeah, private property is fine, but you have a responsibility in the way you use your private property. And you're accountable to the members of your community in terms of the impacts that your use of private property is having. So I guess one way of getting at it would be different religious conceptions, not just so much towards nature, but towards property. And if it's yours, can you just do whatever you want, or where are there certain kinds of limits placed upon your rights to do whatever you want to with your property?
Sure. I mean, that's probably what I can speak about most, because I look at the ways in which different religious traditions shape people's views towards the natural world. So certainly there have been a lot of scholars that have studied Christianity as the most dominant religion here in the U.S. And there's an argument going, started in the 1960s with a historian called Lynn Waite. He argued that Christianity was largely responsible for our environmental crisis. So back in the 1960s, of course, there was already an environmental crisis, which has just gotten worse, but especially pollution. And he argued that because Christians tend to have a otherworldly orientation, it's about salvation, it's about going to heaven, and so that causes them not to care so much about the earth. And then the other reason, he argued, why Christians would be less likely to care about nature is because of the biblical texts that teach that humans are here to have dominion over the natural world, right? And he argued that within Christianity, there actually were more environmentally friendly traditions, but that people hadn't really picked up on them. And I think that's still true. It's changing. So I have noticed a lot of change in the last couple of decades with some Christians getting on board with climate change, but there is kind of a divide there between more conservative evangelical Protestants and more moderate evangelicals or Catholics or others in terms of climate change denial. So that's an issue. But I think, so again, those 2 points, the emphasis on salvation and otherworldliness, and the idea that, well, nature's really just here for humans' use. So, but even with that one, you could see why you might not want to have it polluted. So I think those are some issues that come up in Christian traditions, even though there are many Christians who are environmental activists, but those are sort of parts of the tradition that have worked against caring about the natural world. And then in terms of Judaism and Islam, they have some of the similar problems because they share some of the texts, right? In terms of the Hebrew Bible, or what's called the Old Testament in Christianity, so they share many of those texts. And those Genesis is the one that is used actually in both ways to talk about humans have dominion, humans are here to kind of dominate over other species, and that we should be caring for the creation. So that also comes out of the tradition in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that kind of idea of creation care, that God's made this for us and we should take care of it. So that can lead to more environmentally friendly perspectives. I know less about sort of practice in Judaism and Islam. I have read a little bit recently on green forms of Islam, and there seem to be more sources in their tradition for environmentally friendly practices. And then in terms of Asian traditions, which we have some here in Chico, but not a lot. And I don't know if there's anyone on the city council that would be influenced by that, but there could be. I know that there have been some people that have been interested in Buddhism on the council in the past. But those traditions have more resources for an environmentally friendly perspective, even though they don't always act on them in practice. For instance, they all believe in, or the Hinduism and Buddhists believe in reincarnation. So you might be born as another species, or you might have been another species in a past life. So the way that they think about other species is a little bit different than people that don't have that have more of a separation. And there also are resources in Buddhism. There's a lot of Buddhist environmental activists. And that has to do with the concept of ahimsa, which is nonviolence, which is also in Hinduism. So, and that's the idea why some Buddhists are vegetarians, although they aren't all, that you should, do your best to not harm other life forms, human and other than human. And so, in the case of something, if you were a Buddhist or a Hindu on the city council, which I don't know if there are any, that might be a resource to argue for, both taking it away from that site, but putting in a site where there'd be less destruction of other species, so less harm. So creating a situation in which there's less harm would be the goal. And then, I'm trying to think, and I don't know, there may be, the other thing I would say is that there also are a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious. I don't know about like current council members who might not belong to an organized religion but have really strong beliefs about what's sacred. And for many of those people, not all of them, nature is something that's sacred, right? So they might not come from a religious tradition that teaches that, but they might have developed their own personal beliefs around that. So I think that's possible, but again, I don't know the individual council. I only know one of the individual council members, so I'm not sure about their religious background. So I could say a little more about that, or I don't know if that's enough.